So good morning, friends. Today let us begin with the Unit 1 on intellectual property rights. First, let us look into the concept of discovery and creativity. In the ancient cultures, there was no value for human creativity. The ancient culture had a philosophy that God is a creator and all other things are created by God. And human beings, if they created something, it was believed to be an imitation of something that is already existing in nature. So no value was given to the human creativity. On the other hand, a value was given if the human discovered something, but discovery is not a part of human creativity. Discovery is something that is already existing and human being was just able to find it, right? But later on in history, there came a point where creativity started receiving the attention. Human creativity was valued and there arose a need to protect the creativity. And thus we can say that human creativity is one of the reasons for the origin of the intellectual property rights, right? So let's go into some detail on it. As I was mentioning, there was a point in human history where only discoveries were considered to be act of human achievement, right? Only the something that is already existing, if it was found by human being, then he was given a certain credit for it. Discovery as a phenomenon is not something that is created, right? It is already existing in nature. Human being just found it. These are the things which already exist and they are merely discovered by human being. There was no concept of creativity that existed in ancient cultures. In ancient cultures, human creativity was not given its due credit. Human beings were not attributed with creativity, rather they were attributed with ability to discover things that were already there, right? So if human beings created something, it was not designated as an achievement, right? But if they discovered something that is already existing, right, they were given certain amount of credit for it, but were also said that this is not something that you have created, it was created by God, it already existed in nature, it is of divine origin and you merely found it, right? So the concept that existed in ancient culture was the fact that human beings did not create anything on their own, rather they discovered or converted one form of thing to another. So this is what I was saying to you. Even if a human being came up with a certain artistic design, it was said that this artistic design was a mere imitation of a human being, right? And the designs or the artistic design can only be created by God, and human beings have just imitated it. The philosophy that existed regarded that God was the creator and all other things were the created things. So there were created things and the creator. Now human creativity did not seem to fit very well into this philosophy because creativity was understood as a form of imitation, right? As I was mentioning, it was said that if human being created something, it was only said that he has copied it from somewhere or he has copied it from creator. But later on in human history, there was a point in the time where human creativity was looked as a product in itself, right? So human creativity started to gain the attention. It was not something that was derived or it was of divine origin. Human creativity was not of divine origin or it was not something that was derived. It was something which human beings were made themselves capable of. It was something that human beings made themselves capable of. That is, it was being recognized that even human beings can come up with new ideas which are not of divine origin and which was not something that was derived. That was the capability of his own intellect. So at that point, there arose a need to protect the works of creativity, right? So in order to enjoy the benefits of creation, this creativity of a human being was being protected, or there was a need to protect this creativity. Thus, we can say that creativity in itself had an impact on the growth and originality and origin of intellectual property right. Now, meaning of intellectual property right. Intellectual refers to things that are coming out of human intellect. Okay. For instance, ideas that come out of intellect. Now, these are not the simple ideas. These are not the regular ideas. These are the ideas that are complicated ideas. This requires mental effort. This requires constant and careful thinking over longer duration of time to come with an idea that is life changing, to come with an idea that is going to make a difference to the world, to come with an idea that has never been existing, right? So for instance, ideas that come out of human intellect. Being intellectual refers to the ability to think and understand things, and sometimes these things can be complicated. So this is what I was discussing. So an idea is something that comes out of a mental effort. It requires a constant mental effort. It requires a constant thinking over a certain period of time to come with a really a game-changing idea. We could say that an idea is a product of constant careful thinking, and it depends on the intellectual ability of an individual. Now, this is a very famous dialogue from the movie Inception. The director of this movie is Christopher Nolan, and this movie came in the year around 2010. So, what this dialogue says is that what is the most resilient parasite, right? Is it a bacteria? Is it a virus? Is it an intestinal worm? What is the most resilient parasite? No, the most resilient parasite is an idea. This parasite, that is idea, is highly resilient, it is highly contagious. Once an idea has taken the hold of brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate it, right? So if you have an idea which you think can make a difference to the world, you cannot think of anything else, right? So an idea that is fully formed, fully understood, that sticks right in there somewhere, right? So this movie Inception was directed by Christopher Nolan, and the idea of this movie was that the characters can go into the brain of other individuals and extradite the idea or steal the idea from the brains of other individuals, right, or minds of other individuals. So this idea, when Christopher Nolan was stuck with this idea, he was very anxious, and he could not resist himself from thinking deeper and deeper into this idea, and he came with a very spectacular movie, and he was content only when he was able to come up with this movie, right? So that is what is an idea. It requires a lot of mental effort, right? It is not a regular idea. This idea will make you stand out from the rest of the world. It should be a game changing idea. It should be a world changing idea, right? So meaning of intellectual in intellectual property is, it is the idea that is coming from the constant careful thinking of a mental effort, right? Now this idea can be in different forms, so that we will discuss in the further slides. Then let us look into meaning of property. Now we'll be discussing here just a general meaning of property, not the meaning of property in intellectual property, right? So what is a property? Property can be either a public property or it can be a private property. These are the two broad classifications of property. For instance, public property is something which is held in common, right? It is also called as commons, right? Everyone can go and utilize that property. And private property is something which is exclusive to a individual. It is something which a person holds for himself individually. Now consider a land. And now land can be a public property or it can be a private property, right? Now land, it exists in time and space, right? Suppose you and your neighbor, you own a land side by side. So you, both of them, you can go together. You can have the documents which was sanctioned to you at the ownership, at the time of ownership of the land, and you can clearly define the boundaries of the land, right? You can roam around the land, you can measure your area of the land, you can even fence it, protect it so that other people do not intrude into it, right? So this is the meaning of property in real world, right, which exists in time and space, which can be touched, which can be felt. In fact, it is tangible in nature, right? Now let us look into the meaning of property in intellectual property. How is it different from this property which exists in the real world? So the property in intellectual property is not bound by time and space, right? It cannot be defined by certain boundaries, and it is indivisible, right? The intellectual property can be consumed by any number of people without depleting its resources, right? So intellectual property is intangible. It cannot be touched. It cannot be felt. So the domain of intellectual property is in terms of expression, invention, identity, appearance, confidentiality. So what are these terms? These are the properties in the arena of intellectual property, right? So intellectual property can be an expression. Now what is an intellectual? Intellectual is an idea, right? If you come with an idea of expression, then this expression becomes your property. If you come with an idea of invention, then this invention becomes your property. If you come with an idea of identity, then this identity becomes your property. If you come with an idea of appearance, then this idea of appearance becomes your property, right? And finally, similarly, it can be applied to confidentiality. Then what is an intellectual property? It is a property which is a product of human creative labor, right? It is a creation of human mind. It is a creation of human intellect, and hence the expression intellectual property. Intellectual property is a category of property that includes intangible creations of human intellect. Now, as I was discussing the difference between tangible and intangible property, human intellect property or intellectual property is intangible in nature. It cannot be touched, it cannot be felt, there are no specific boundaries to it, right? And it is intangible in nature, whereas property in the real world, it exists in time and space. It can be measured, it can be touched and felt. You have no debate over what is my property and what is my neighbor's property, right? It can be clearly defined, and it can be clearly defined physically. Now, intellectual property refers to creation of intellect, right? If you create an intellect, then the ownership of that intellect will be given to you by law. So intellectual property refers to creation of intellect for which domination is assigned to designated owners by law. Intellectual property refers to creation of mind which has both moral as well as commercial value. So this commercial factor and moral factors we'll be discussing in subsequent slides, right? So what can be different kinds of intellectual properties? Like intellectual is an idea that is originating from your intellect, and the properties can be in the form of an invention. The property can be in the form of literary and artistic work. The property can be in the form of symbols, names and images used in commerce. Now this property is still in your mind, it is still in your intellect, right? But to show to the world your intellectual property, your intangible property, you will need to make use of tangible objects, right? In somewhat simplified way, one can state that the intellectual property relates to pieces of information, right, which are intangible in nature, which are incorporated into tangible objects at the same time in an unlimited number of copies at different locations anywhere in the world, right? So last time I gave you an example of a book on Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. What did I say? I said that J.K. Rowling wrote a book on Harry Potter, and when you see a book, there are pages in the book, there's ink in the book, right? And there are other physical aspects of the book that you can touch, you can see, you can feel, right? But the expression of idea or a story of a magical boy who was born with magical powers, who went to a school where he was threatened, right? And people tried to kill him, but he survived, right? And so that expression of idea is very attractive. That is an intellectual property which is intangible in nature. That was in her intellect, right? First an idea came that she would write a book on magical power, and then magical book, or she would approach a genre of the magic, and in that she came up with this story. And when this story was in her intellect, it was a creation of her human creative labor, and then she produced it onto a tangible object like a book. So the property is not in those copies, right? But the information reflected in those copies. So are you getting it? So the property is not in those copies, but the information or expression of idea reflected in those So intellectual property relates to original ideas, like the ideas should be novel, the ideas which have never been seen before, right? It should result it, and these original ideas will result or originate or emanate from research, and generally it covers some kind of critical business information. Intellectual property refers to that set of properties that emanates from human creative labor. So this we have already discussed. Again, we are discussing here about how intellectual property is different property in the real world. Now, when we mention intellectual property, we are specifically trying to define intellectual property as that is distinct from real property. For example, a land, a laptop or pen. These are property that exist in real world. You can touch them, you can feel them, they are tangible in nature. They have borders to it. There is no dispute regarding the boundaries of it. That is, there is no perceivable dispute with regard to where the borders or boundaries or counters of these properties are. So we do not have problems in ascertaining the boundaries of this property, whereas when we come to intellectual property, we do have certain issues to understanding the outer limits or the boundaries or the private space of intellectual property. Now, we have already discussed this. So manifestation of intellectual property. So intellectual property manifests in various forms. Like intellectual property can be an invention. So there is an idea and the idea is related to invention. And if you have invented something, then that invention becomes your property, right? Then an intellectual property can be in the form of literary work or a book, right? Or it can be in the form of unique symbols. It can be in the form of unique designs. It can be a secret recipe. Thus, again, intellectual property refers to things that emanates from human creative labor. So from till now, we are trying to understand what is intellectual, right? And what is property? How the intellectual property is different from a property that exists in the real world. Like a real world property can be a land, it can be a laptop, it can be a pen, it can be a book, but an intellectual property, it will be in the form of an invention, it will be in the form of a literary work, it will be in the form of a unique symbol, it will be in the form of a unique design, it can be in the form of a secret recipe. Now we are going to see what are rights. Okay, so first we will see what are rights in the real world, and then we will see what are rights in the world of intellectual property. So what are rights, right? A right refers to a legal entitlement, something which an individual is entitled to get legally, right? So if you have a certain right, then it is protected by law, and then you can perform your act according to the or within the boundaries of that law, right? And if someone tries to violate your rights, then we can bring about a criminal offense against him, right? Like right can be your right to vote, your right to protection, right? Every single individual of this country, India, is entitled to be protected by the government of India. Like Kulbhushan Jadhav, right? There's a case, he's an individual, he's an Indian, he's caught in Pakistan. For many years, we are still fighting for him because he has the right that his rights will be protected by the government of India anywhere he goes into the world, right? So right refers to a legal entitlement, something which an individual is entitled to get legally. And if the right is violated, it is deemed as unlawful, and the violation of which leaves the person whose right is violated with a remedy. So he will have an option either to file a criminal offense, or he can ask for monetary compensation or something kind of that. Rights can be in two broad senses, right? So first can be a right which is inherent to human being, and the other can be a right which is out of the inherent nature of human being. So rights may express itself inherently in a human being, like what we say about human rights, like your right to vote, your right to privacy. These are the things which are inherent in a human being. There are also rights that manifest in things beyond the human being, like for example, a property. Suppose you own a property, then that property, if it is legally yours, then you have a right to protect that property. You might have seen the boards like trespassers are not allowed into this land, and if trespassing is found, then you will be prosecuted. Is it clear? So that is his property. He can decide who will enter his property and who will not enter his property. Is it okay? Right. So we have the rights that manifest in a human being because of his character of human being, like right to vote, right to privacy, those who are what we call as inherent rights. And we also have rights that express on things because human beings possess or own or transfer things, right? So here we can consider an example of a land. Rights can be of a general nature which are shared by people, like the right of protection of a citizen expects from a government is a general right which every citizen can claim and every citizen will get, whereas there are certain rights that could be operated or that could be exercised in an exclusive manner, right? So general right is like I said, every individual in India is to be protected by government of India. So this right is shared by all of us in a common. And there can be an exclusive right, like if you possess something, if you have a legal document for its possession, then that becomes your exclusive right. Again, further going into what are rights. Now, when the rights offer you exclusivity, like if you are the owner of you are the only owner of that right, it means that you have the right to stop people from doing certain acts. For instance, if you own a property, then you have a right to exclude people from getting into the property or enjoying that property, right? So this is what I was saying about the trespassing of people into your land. So if you own a book, you have the right to exclude people from reading that book or from looking into that book or from using that book in any way, right? So here we are not speaking about expression of idea. It is a general book. It is, if I own it, if I have a proper bill for it, and if nobody is objecting it, then I can I can ensure that these people should not use my book or these people can use my book. So exclusive rights are rights which confer the ability on a person to stop others from doing something without your consent. So without your approval, without your consent, the other people cannot infringe your property, the other people cannot trespass you in your property, the other people cannot overtake your property. Is it clear? And if they do so, then you have got a remedy for it. You can choose the legal option. Now you have understood what are rights in real world, right? What are rights? What are rights in real world? The rights in the real world are your exclusive rights to protect your own property, right? Now let us look into what is meaning of rights in intellectual property rights. So meaning of right in intellectual property right. So when we talk about rights in connection with intellectual property, we are talking about the rights that emanates from the intellectual property which are capable of being protected. Now, in the real world, you had a certain property, then you had a right to protect that property. Similarly, in the intellectual property rights, if you own a certain intellectual property, it can be in the form of an invention, it can be in the form of a book, it can be in the form of a design, it can be in the form of symbol. So if this is exclusively your property or it is exclusively creation of your human intellect labor, and if you approach a proper or if you register that thing, then there will be certain rights given to you for a certain duration of time in which you will have exclusive control over your intellectual property. No one can use your intellectual property without your consent. And if someone uses your intellectual property without your consent, without your approval, then that will be termed as unlawful. For instance, if there is an artistic work in the form of a book, then the creator of the book or the person who owns the book or who created the book could stop other people from using that book, from making copies of that book, from decimating information from that book by different ways because he has an exclusive right over it. Like J.K. Rowling has an exclusive right over to the people who can make copies of her book, to the people who can make movies out of her book, right? To the people who can use the information from her book to write something related with slight changes to it, right? So this is the right which is given to the owner of an intellectual property. It is similar to the rights in the real world, right? But the names of the rights in for the protection of the intellectual property are different from that in the real world, right? So if the exclusive rights based in an invention, like first we considered an example of an artistic work, right? Now we are considering an example of an invention. What is an invention? It is a property. Is it a property in real world? No, it is a property of which is originated from your intellect, right? So it is an idea of your intellect. So if the exclusive rights vests in invention, the owner of the invention gets the liberty to make or manufacture, to sell or offer to sell, to import and to use the right in that invention, right? So if I have a certain patent, if I have a certain invention, then I can decide who can use my invention. I can decide who I can sell my invention to. I can decide whether if someone is unlawfully utilizing my intellectual property, then should I allow him or should I file a criminal offense against him? Is it okay? Right. So, and any person who does these things without the consent of the right owner, we should say that the person has violated the right of the right owner. Is it okay? Right. So now let as in last few slides we have discussed on intellectual, we have discussed on property, we have discussed on rights, we have discussed on what is intellectual, we have discussed on property in real world, we have discussed on property in the intellectual world, and then we have discussed rights in the real world, like inherent human being rights, or then the right of a landowner, and then we looked onto the right which can protect your intellectual property. So intellectual property rights are like any other property rights. They allow the inventors or owners of properties. Now what are properties here? The properties are intellectual properties, not the real world properties, to benefit from their own work or investment in a creation, right? So it is obvious, if I own something, then I should be benefited from it. Suppose I come with a process which is very highly giving me a large amount of profits, right? And if I start that process and everyone comes and sees that he is doing this kind of things and he's making a lot of money out of it, then everyone will start making the same process, and the economic benefits that I should have derived from my invention won't be possible for me. Is it okay? So what is to be done is that, or what intellectual property rights do is that they provide exclusive right to the owner of the intellectual property for a certain duration of time to enjoy the benefits of his creation. But it is only for a certain duration of time. After that duration of time, mostly in case of patents and copyrights, after that duration of time, the information is revealed to public. It is already revealed to public, but then the public can use that information without the consent of the owner of the intellectual property. Now this has two benefits. Initially what you did is that you protected the right of an owner of the intellectual property, right? For suppose 20 years you gave him the authority that no one can use your property, your intellectual property, without your consent. But after 20 years you made it to available, where you made it available to the public. Now public is also benefiting from it. So what you are doing two things. First is you are encouraging an individual to go for more and more innovations, and then what you are doing, you are also encouraging or you are also disseminating that information into general public, so that there is a development of all the people at a time, right? Okay, so intellectual property rights are a group of rights which manifest on different expression of ideas, right? So this expression of ideas can be in the form of copyright, or it can be in the form of industrial property. So copyright and related rights to copyrights it include. So copyright covers literary works such as novels, poems and plays, films, music, artistic work. Artistic work may involve drawing, paintings, photographs and sculptures, and architectural design. And rights related to copyrights, these are also called as neighboring rights. So rights related to copyrights, which are also called as neighboring rights, include those of performing artists in their performances, producers of phonograms in their recordings, and broadcasters in their radio and television programs. And second is industrial property. Industrial property is related to patent, trademark, designs, geographical indications. So these are rights, like by using the right of patent, I can protect my invention. By using the right of trademark, I can protect my symbols. By using the right of designs, I can protect my unique industrial designs. By using the right of general indication, I can claim that this is the product which is belonging from my geographical locations. So now intellect, property and right? So what is an intellect? It is the idea that originates from your mental effort, or it is the creation of your human intellect or creative human labor. So this is an idea. Now if the property is expression, if there is a certain idea and the property of that idea is expression, then that expression can be protected by means of a copyright. So right to protect the expression is a copyright. Right to protect the idea of invention is a patent. Right to protect the idea of a quality or identity is a trademark. Right to protect the idea of appearance is a design. A right to protect the idea or to keep the business information confidential and not disclose it ever to the public is protected by the right of trade secrets, right? So I'm sure that now you are able to distinguish between, or you are able to define what is intellectual, what is property, and what is right. And you are also able to distinguish between intellectual property and intellectual property right. Is it okay? So intellectual property is only a property of your intellect. And when you speak about intellectual property right, there is certain right by which you can protect your intellectual property. So now let us look into the importance of intellectual property rights. Now intellectual property rights are accepted all over the world due to some important reasons, right? The progress and well-being of humanity rest on its capacity to create and invent new work in the areas of technology and culture, right? Now see, today is a pandemic situation. We are not able to conduct the classes in college, right? But even though our education is going on, right, we are interacting over live sessions on Microsoft Team. So what is this? This is the progress of humanity, right? Initially, if you go around 100 years ago, these technologies were not available, right? So the progress and well-being of humanity rests on its capacity to create and invent new works in the areas of technology and culture. So no matter how adverse conditions you are exposed to, there is always a certain solution to it, and this solution is derived from the progress that the human being is making. The legal protection of new creation encourages the commitment of additional resources for further innovation. Now you know that this is a high paying job, and if a person assures me that your ideas will be protected for certain duration of time, it will be your exclusive rights, right? Then it enables a firm to invest more and more amount of money in research and development so that they can come with more and more intellectual properties, and then because of the origin of the intellectual property rights, their intellectual properties will be protected and they will be able to enjoy the fruits and benefits of that over a duration of time. So it provides incentives to the individuals for new creations, like creators can enjoy fruits of inventions for certain years and they will have an exclusive right about who utilizes their invention for their purpose. And if someone utilizes without their consent, they can take a legal action against him. So it provides due recognition to the creators and inventors. Like if someone is there who is owning a lot of patents, right, then his name will be in the public. Like you can see an example of Thomas Edison, who is a school dropout. He has 1093 patents to his name. So these are a lot of patents for a single individual, right? Filing a single patent can take years, and he had filed 1093 patents. So imagine what amount of intellect he had, what amount of novel ideas he had, and in a year, how many patents he might have published so that he was able to have 1093 patents at the end of his life. So creates and supports high paying jobs, right? So this is a very high paying job, right? You have exclusive rights over it. And if someone wants to utilize your idea, then he can pay you a royalty. Thereby it creates and supports high paying jobs. It ensures the availability of original products to the customers, thereby it protects their interest. So this is what I was saying you in the last class. Like I give you an example of a Nike. Like if a t-shirt of Nike is being used, then there are certain functional criteria to it. Like it will immediately take out the sweat, it will immediately take out the heat, it will make me feel comfortable no matter how much I sweat, no matter what is the temperature outside, right? But if the intellectual property about the functionality of the t-shirt is not protected, then any layman, any person who is working in the, like in Ichalkaranji also, I can produce a t-shirt and claim that it is a Nike's t-shirt because there is no one protecting the right of Nike. But if the Nike comes to know that there is a person in this place and he is trying to unlawfully take away the credits of my work, or unlawfully he is utilizing my name, so he can go and stop him. So for economic growth and competitiveness, again the intellectual property rights are needed. See, lot amount of patents come from USA and China. You can see at their economic growth and the level of competitiveness they bring, right? And to obtain breakthrough solutions to the global challenges. So these are the importance and need of intellectual property right. Right. So moving on. So now I think you will be able to distinguish between intellectual property and intellectual property rights. So what are intellectual property? Intellectual property are the property that manifest in certain creations made by human beings, and intellectual property rights are the rights which are used for protection of this intellectual property. Intellectual property and intellectual property rights, that is IP and IPR, are in most places used interchangeably, and there is nothing wrong with that, because many a times when we talk about intellectual property, we also want to cover about the right which protects the intellectual property. Like if I say patent kiya hai maine, so what does it mean? That when what does it mean when I say ki patent kiya hai maine? It means I had a certain intellectual property of invention, and that property of invention is protected by a right of patent, and usko abhi koi छेड़ नहीं सकता 20 साल तक. Is it okay? Right. Now this is in your syllabus, so I just mentioned a single slide, and we have already discussed this, like movable and immovable properties. These are tangible properties. It can be touched and it can be felt. It exists in time and space. Like movable property are car and bikes, and immovable properties like land and building. And intellectual property, as I have discussed, it is an idea of expression. It is an idea of invention. It is an idea of design, or it is an idea of symbol. Okay. Thank you.